The war had ended many years ago, but Colonel Mason never truly left it behind. Instead of returning to the life most people expected him to rebuild, he chose to remain in a small, forgotten town where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else. The streets were quiet, the houses worn down by years of neglect, and the people carried on with their daily routines as if the rest of the world no longer mattered. Mason blended into this forgotten place, but there was something about him that always stood out. His presence carried weight, not just because of the medals he had once earned, but because of the silence he wore like a second skin. To outsiders, he looked like an aging soldier who had given everything to his country and was now simply waiting for life to pass him by. But that was only the surface. The real scars he carried were hidden deep inside, buried where no one could see them. Younger men in town, especially those who had only heard stories about war, often looked at Mason with a mix of curiosity and dismissal. They gave him a nickname, the Relic. To them, he was nothing more than an old reminder of a fight they never had to face. They saw the gray hair, the stiff walk, the tired eyes, and they assumed his best years were long behind him. They believed he was a man frozen in time, clinging to a past that no longer mattered. But what they did not understand was that Colonel Mason still carried a fire within him, a fire that had been forged on the battlefield and had never gone out. It was not the kind of fire that burned recklessly, but the steady kind, the kind that survives storms, betrayal, and loss. It was the fire of a man who had seen darkness and refused to let it break him completely. Every morning, Mason woke up before dawn, not because he had to, but because his body still remembered the discipline of war. He walked through the empty streets, greeting no one, but noticing everything: the sound of the wind, the movement of shadows, the way the world could be both peaceful and threatening at the same time. He did not talk much about the battles he had fought, nor did he share the weight of the decisions he once had to make. To him, those memories were both a burden and a shield. They reminded him of who he was, but also kept him distant from who he might have become. Though the world had moved on, Colonel Mason never let go of his duty. In his silence, in his scars, and in his burning spirit, he remained more than just the relic. He was a reminder that war does not end when the guns go quiet. It lives on in the people who carry its weight forever. High in the rugged mountains, a new threat began to rise. It was not an official army, nor a recognized force, but a rogue militia made up of men who thrived on chaos. They moved like shadows, striking suddenly and disappearing into the cliffs before anyone could react. Unlike traditional armies, they did not target soldiers or military posts. Instead, they aimed their fury at ordinary people, farmers in the fields, travelers on lonely roads, and families trying to survive in small villages. Their cruelty was not random. It was a deliberate strategy designed to spread fear, to show the government that it could not protect its own citizens. Each attack was like a message carved in blood. No one was safe. The government, already struggling with unrest and corruption, found itself paralyzed. Trust within its own ranks began to break down. Leaders in the capital looked at their soldiers with suspicion, wondering if they were strong enough or loyal enough to face such a cunning enemy. Some whispered that the malicious tactics were too advanced, too precise, almost as if they were being guided by someone who had studied modern warfare in depth. That possibility alone terrified officials. If the enemy truly had that kind of knowledge, then conventional strategies would not be enough. The thought that their own troops might be outsmarted on the battlefield shook the government to its core. As weeks passed, desperation spread like a sickness through both the army and the population. Rumors filled the air, each more frightening than the last. Some said the militia had access to foreign weapons, smuggled through secret routes across the border. Others claimed the group was being funded by powerful hands that wanted to see the country fall into chaos. Villagers spoke of strange signals flashing in the night sky, believing the enemy had new technology far beyond what the government possessed. Whether these stories were true or not did not matter. Fear had taken root, and fear itself became another weapon in the hands of the militia. On the ground, soldiers faced the impossible task of fighting an invisible enemy. They set up checkpoints, launched patrols, and tried to protect supply lines, but the militia always seemed one step ahead. Convoys were ambushed in narrow passes, communication lines were cut, and civilians who cooperated with the government vanished without a trace. Every defeat weakened morale, and every rumor of betrayal made the soldiers doubt one another. The government's inability to strike back effectively created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, panic grew. It was in this tense atmosphere, where civilians trembled, soldiers doubted, and leaders questioned their own strength, that the future of the nation hung in the balance. Desperation was no longer just in the air. It was in the hearts of everyone, waiting for a spark that could either bring salvation or complete collapse. Mason had been retired for years. Once a respected soldier, now he lived a life of silence and shadows. Time had not been kind to him. His body carried the marks of countless battles, and his spirit was weighed down by memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. People in his small town saw only an old man who kept to himself, someone broken by the past and too tired to face the present. But deep inside, beneath the scars and the silence, the soldier in him was not completely gone. It waited quietly as if asleep until something would awaken it once more. One evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, Mason found an envelope slipped under his door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the markings on the paper were not. His trained eyes recognized the pattern immediately, a coded message, the kind only old comrades would know. Slowly, carefully, he broke the seal and read the words inside, "We need you. They're taking over." The moment was heavy, almost unreal. His hands trembled as he held the message, the paper rattling between his fingers. For years, he had wanted nothing more than to escape the violence of his past, to live out his final days in peace. But peace had never truly belonged to him. As he read the words again, his body reacted before his mind could catch up. His heart pounded, his breath deepened, and his eyes, once tired and weary, hardened with focus. The soldier inside him was awake again. Memories of his oath came rushing back. Long ago, he had sworn to protect the innocent, to stand against those who sought power through fear and violence. That promise had cost him friends, family, and nearly his own life. Yet, even after retirement, he never allowed himself to break it. He thought his fight had ended with the last war, but now, this message proved otherwise. Somewhere out there, an enemy was rising, and his old comrades were calling him back into the storm. For a brief moment, Mason hesitated. Age had stolen much from him. His speed, his strength, his confidence. Could he still be the man they needed him to be? Could an old, broken soldier truly make a difference against a new and powerful enemy? Doubt weighed on him heavily. But then he remembered the faces of those he had fought beside, the innocent lives he had once defended, and the blood he had seen spilled by men who believed they could take whatever they wanted. He realized that this fight was not about whether he was ready. It was about whether he could allow himself to stand by and do nothing. And Mason was not a man who stood by. Not then. Not now. With the message still in his hand, he whispered to himself the words of his old oath. He had once sworn to protect, and he would again. He returned to the same training ground where his journey as a soldier had once begun. The place was old, covered in dust, and nearly forgotten by time. The paint on the walls was peeling, the track was cracked, and the equipment was rusty. Yet for Mason, it was not just a field of broken concrete and fading memories, it was the place where warriors were forged. And he had come back to start again, this time alone. Every morning, before the sun rose, he walked to the training ground in silence. There were no cheering voices, no fellow soldiers pushing him forward, no instructors barking orders. It was just Mason and the echoes of his past. He dropped down into the dirt and began his push-ups. At first, his arms shook violently. Every movement sent sharp pain shooting through his shoulders and chest. His lungs burned with the effort, and his body begged him to stop. Years of age and silence had taken their toll. But Mason refused to give in. Each push-up, no matter how weak or slow, was a reminder that the fight inside him was not finished. After push-ups came the sprints. The ground was uneven, and the dust rose in clouds beneath his boots. His legs felt heavy, as though he carried the weight of his entire past with him. His heart pounded wildly, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Yet, step by step, sprint after sprint, something began to change. His body, though old and battered, remembered. Muscles long and used started to awaken. Endurance slowly returned, hidden strength waiting for its moment to rise. What had once been unbearable pain began to turn into progress. Days stretched into weeks. Mason kept coming back, again and again, each session harder than the last. He pushed himself until sweat drenched his clothes, until his hands were raw and his lungs burned like fire. But with every drop of sweat, his body grew stronger, and his spirit sharper. The weakness that had once chained him down was breaking apart. The discipline of the old soldier was returning, piece by piece. The townspeople who passed by sometimes stopped to watch. To them, he looked like nothing more than a weary old man punishing himself for reasons they could not understand. They saw him stumble, fall, and collapse into the dirt, only to rise again, refusing to quit. They did not realize that what they were witnessing was not punishment, but transformation. Mason was not destroying himself. He was rebuilding. He was no longer just an old man lost in his memories. He was once again becoming what he was always meant to be, a warrior. The world around him might have forgotten his strength, but Mason had not. With every push-up, every sprint, every breath, he was sharpening himself like a blade. The old warrior was back, and his claws were ready for the battles yet to come. At first, the young recruits didn't take Mason seriously. To them, he was just an old man trying to hold on to the past. His hair was gray, his face lined with age, and his body looked slower than theirs. They whispered among themselves, laughed behind his back, and even mocked him openly. Some of them called him Grandpa, while others smirked and said he was too old to belong in a camp built for the strong and the young. One bold recruit finally said it to his face, "You're too old, Colonel. You can't keep up with us." The others laughed, sure that the old warrior had nothing left to prove. But Mason said nothing. He did not argue, he did not shout, and he did not try to defend himself with words. Instead, he watched them quietly, his eyes steady and sharp. He had seen this arrogance before, in the faces of young men who thought strength was measured only by age or muscle. Mason knew better. True strength lived in discipline, in skill, in the kind of experience that only years of battle could teach. And soon he would remind them of that truth. The opportunity came during a sparring session. The recruits gathered in a circle, eager to test themselves and show off their speed and power. The leader of the group, a tall and confident young man, stepped forward and challenged Mason directly. The recruits laughed and clapped, excited to see the old soldier stumble and fall. To them, this was nothing more than entertainment, a chance to prove that the old ways were finished. Mason stepped into the circle with calm movements. He did not posture or show off. He simply raised his hands, ready for the fight. The young leader rushed at him with all the energy of youth, swinging fast and hard, hoping to end the match in seconds. But Mason had spent a lifetime studying opponents like this. His eyes tracked every movement, every mistake, every opening. In less than a heartbeat, Mason moved. With one swift motion, he sidestepped the attack, trapped the young man's arm, and in the blink of an eye disarmed him completely. The recruit's weapon clattered to the ground, and Mason held him in a position that ended the fight instantly. It had taken only seconds. The camp fell silent. The recruits who had been laughing just moments ago now stood frozen, their mouths open, their eyes wide. The man they had mocked, the man they had called too old, had just defeated their strongest fighter with ease. There was no arguing with what they had seen. Mason released the young recruit, stepped back, and gave no speech. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. From that day on, the recruits no longer mocked him. They looked at Mason with respect, some even with awe. They finally understood that age did not weaken him. If anything, it had only sharpened him into something far more dangerous. The old warrior had proven that he still belonged, and that experience would always outmatch arrogance. The young soldiers were full of energy and pride. Every day they trained with weights, weapons, and endless drills that built muscle and speed. To them, victory meant overpowering the enemy with sheer strength and force. They wanted to strike hard, move fast, and break through anything in their path. In their minds, war was nothing more than a contest of power. Whoever hit harder and faster would always win. But Mason knew better. He had seen too many battles to believe such a simple idea. Strength could win a fight, but only strategy could win a war. Mason began to teach them lessons that were far different from what they expected. Instead of encouraging louder shouts, heavier strikes, or longer marches, he introduced them to silence. He showed them how to move quietly across rough terrain, how to control their breathing so footsteps left no trace, and how to blend into the shadows instead of charging forward blindly. The recruits struggled at first. Some grew impatient, thinking it was pointless to crawl through mud or stay hidden for hours without moving. They wanted action, not patience. Mason corrected them harshly. "An enemy you can't see is an enemy who will destroy you," he warned. Next, he taught them about traps. He demonstrated how a simple piece of wire, a carefully placed pit, or a hidden snare could do more damage than brute strength ever could. He made them walk through mock battlefields where every careless step triggered something unexpected, nets, alarms, or traps that would have cost them their lives in a real fight. The young recruits quickly learned that their muscles could not protect them from mistakes. Only careful thinking could. Then came precision. Mason drilled them on how to strike with accuracy, not just force. He taught them to study the enemy, to find weak points, and to strike only when the moment was right. "One precise strike is worth 100 wasted blows," he growled during training. Under his guidance, they learned to conserve energy, to wait for the perfect chance, and to deliver a blow that ended the fight instantly. At first, many of the recruits resisted these lessons. They wanted glory, they wanted noise, and they wanted to feel powerful. But after weeks of training under Mason's eye, they began to see the truth. Strength without strategy left them vulnerable. Force without patience left them exposed. Slowly, their pride gave way to respect. They realized that Mason was not only training their bodies, he was sharpening their minds. Finally, one evening, after another long day of drills, Mason gathered them together. He looked at their tired, mud-stained faces and spoke the words that stayed with them forever: "Brains win battles." His voice was firm, his eyes hard with experience. In that moment, the recruits understood. Muscles alone could not save them. But strategy, patience, and intelligence, the tools Mason had given them, just might. The night was silent, with only the sound of crickets and the distant wind moving through the trees. The moonlight barely touched the ground, leaving most of the forest drowned in shadows. It was the perfect cover for a mission that demanded absolute secrecy. Under this blanket of darkness, Mason led a small strike team deep into enemy territory. There were no loud orders, no unnecessary movements, and no wasted energy. Every step was measured, every hand signal carefully chosen. The recruits followed him closely, their eyes alert, their breathing controlled, and their trust in him stronger than ever. For many of these young soldiers, this was the first time they had entered hostile ground without the comfort of large numbers or heavy support. Fear pressed against them like a weight, threatening to break their focus. But Mason's presence steadied them. He walked with quiet confidence, moving like a shadow that belonged to the night. His calmness was contagious. If their leader showed no fear, then neither would they. The path was dangerous, filled with hidden traps and enemy patrols. Mason's experience guided them through it all. At one point, he raised his fist suddenly, and the team froze in place. Just a few yards ahead, a tripwire stretched across the trail. One careless step would have set off an explosion that could have ended the mission before it began. With silent precision, Mason disarmed the trap, then signaled the team forward. Not a single word was spoken, yet every recruit understood exactly what to do. As they moved deeper into the territory, Mason continued to make decisions that kept them alive. When enemy scouts passed nearby, he guided his team into the underbrush, forcing them to hold their breath until danger moved on. When the sound of boots echoed too close, he motioned for complete stillness, teaching them the value of patience and timing. He showed them how to blend into the darkness, how to wait for the right moment, and how to strike only when necessary. Eventually, they reached their objective, a hidden supply cache guarded by enemy soldiers. The recruits looked to Mason, waiting for his plan. He studied the guards for a few moments, analyzing their movements, their weaknesses, their blind spots. Then, with quick hand signals, he laid out the attack. The recruits executed the plan flawlessly, striking with silence and precision. Within minutes, the enemy was neutralized and the cache secured. When it was over, the recruits exchanged glances. Not long ago, they had doubted Mason, mocking him as an old man who no longer belonged on the battlefield. But now, after following him through enemy lines, after watching him make perfect decisions under pressure, they trusted him completely. He had proven himself not through words, but through action. For Mason, this was not about pride. It was about duty, discipline, and survival. The recruits had finally learned the lesson he had been trying to teach them all along. True leadership is earned in the darkest of hours, when every choice determines life or death. The silence of the valley shattered in an instant. One moment, the strike team was moving cautiously under Mason's lead, and the next, the militia's traps snapped shut. Explosions ripped through the night, lighting up the dark sky in flashes of fire. The ground shook violently, dust and debris rising into the air as echoes thundered across the valley walls. For the young soldiers, it was chaos unlike anything they had ever faced. Their training suddenly seemed distant, useless against the deafening roar of bombs and the sudden rush of gunfire. Fear spread through them like wildfire. Some of the recruits froze in place, unable to move as the world seemed to collapse around them. Others shouted in confusion, their voices drowned by the explosions. A few even turned as if to run, panic clouding their judgment. The enemy had planned this ambush well, hoping to crush the spirit of these inexperienced soldiers before the battle had even truly begun. And for a moment, it looked as though the plan might succeed. But then, above the chaos, Mason's voice cut through like a blade. He roared commands with a power that demanded obedience, his words carrying over the blasts and gunfire. There was no hesitation in his tone, no fear in his orders. His voice was the anchor the recruits desperately needed in that storm of terror. To them, he sounded less like a man and more like a force of nature, unyielding, unstoppable, alive with fire. "Hold your ground," he shouted, his voice echoing through the valley. "Get to cover. Return fire on my mark." The young soldiers, who only seconds ago had been gripped by panic, found strength in his commands. They snapped out of their fear and began to move with purpose. They ducked behind rocks, raised their weapons, and started to fight back. The valley that had seemed like a death trap now became a battlefield where they stood a chance, not because of their strength, but because of Mason's leadership. Every order Mason gave was precise, every movement deliberate. He directed squads to flank, signaled others to hold position, and personally led counterattacks when needed. His presence alone shifted the tide. The recruits no longer saw him as an old man clinging to memories. In that moment, he was a living legend, the kind of warrior they had only heard about in stories. As the firefight raged on, the recruits realized something powerful. Mason was not simply leading them, he was carrying them, steadying their hearts and sharpening their courage. Where panic had nearly destroyed them, his roar had given them focus. And with that focus, they fought back fiercely, forcing the militia to realize that their trap had not broken its prey. In the middle of smoke, fire, and chaos, Mason stood tall, his voice unshaken, his commands unrelenting. For the recruits, he became more than a commander. He became proof that legends are not just born, they are forged in the very heart of battle. The battle reached its breaking point. Smoke filled the valley, the sound of gunfire echoed across the cliffs, and every second felt like an eternity. Mason's team had fought bravely, but the enemy still pressed forward with relentless force. In the distance, Mason's sharp eyes caught sight of something that shifted the entire fight, the militia's weapons cache. Hidden beneath camouflage nets and guarded by only a handful of soldiers, it was the true heart of the enemy's strength. Inside those crates were explosives, rifles, and ammunition that could fuel the militia's war for months. If the cache remained, victory would belong to the enemy. But if it was destroyed, their campaign would collapse overnight. Mason instantly understood the risk. The path to the cache cut off his only escape route. If he moved toward it, he would have no way back to safety. It was a choice between survival and sacrifice. Most men would have hesitated, weighing the cost of their own life. But Mason had lived too long with the burden of war to let fear dictate his actions. His oath still burned within him, the promise to protect others, no matter the cost. He turned to his recruits, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Hold your ground," he ordered. "No matter what happens, keep fighting." They didn't fully understand his plan, but the determination in his eyes told them enough. Without another word, Mason broke away from cover and charged toward the cache. Bullets cut through the air around him, explosions rocked the ground, yet he moved with the speed and precision of the soldier he had always been. Every stride was deliberate, every decision sharp. As he reached the cache, enemy guards rushed to stop him, but Mason fought with a fury that belied his years. He disarmed one soldier, dropped another with a strike, and forced his way to the heart of the enemy's supplies. There, surrounded by crates of weapons, he made his final choice. He planted charges, set timers, and prepared the destruction of everything the militia had built. In that instant, Mason's thoughts grew heavy but clear. "If I fall," he told himself, "let it count. Let this sacrifice mean something. Let it save them." His entire life had been leading to this one act, not medals, not parades, but a single, daring move that could turn the tide of war. The explosion tore through the night like thunder. Flames roared upward, lighting the valley in a fiery glow. The militia's lifeline was gone, their weapons reduced to ash and twisted metal. From their positions, the recruits watched in awe as the sky lit up. They knew at once what Mason had done, and the weight of his sacrifice hit them deeply. Mason had given up his escape, his safety, perhaps even his life, to ensure their survival. In that moment, he was not just their commander. He was the embodiment of courage itself. A man who chose sacrifice over fear, and in doing so, became eternal. The battle had reached its most desperate moment. Smoke thickened in the air, gunfire echoed across the valley, and the ground trembled from the shock of explosions. Mason lay pinned down, a wound spreading blood across his uniform. Every breath was a struggle, each heartbeat heavier than the last. Pain coursed through his body, but his spirit refused to break. Around him, the recruits hesitated. Fear clawed at them, whispering that the fight was lost, that their leader was finished, and that retreat was their only chance to survive. Mason saw it in their eyes, the doubt, the hesitation, the creeping terror that could turn victory into defeat in seconds. He knew this was the moment that would decide everything. If they faltered now, the militia would crush them. If they pressed forward, they could end the battle once and for all. Summoning the last of his strength, Mason forced himself upright, ignoring the blood and the agony. His voice rose above the chaos, sharp and commanding, a voice that could not be ignored. "Advance," he roared. The single word tore through the battlefield like thunder. It cut through the smoke, through the fear, through the panic in every recruit's heart. In that instant, it was not just an order, it was a lifeline. The young soldiers straightened, their fear replaced by determination. Mason's command gave them something greater than survival to fight for. It gave them purpose. With a unified cry, the recruits surged forward. No longer scattered or hesitant, they moved with discipline and precision. Mason's training had transformed them. Every step was calculated, every strike deliberate. They advanced not as frightened boys, but as warriors sharpened by fire. The militia, confident only moments before, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. Their lines faltered as the recruits struck with surgical accuracy, targeting weak points, cutting off escape routes, and breaking their defenses piece by piece. The valley erupted with the sound of battle, but this time the momentum had shifted. The militia's trap, their numbers, their weapons, all of it meant nothing against soldiers who refused to surrender. Each recruit carried Mason's voice in their minds, pushing them forward, reminding them that strength without courage was nothing. They pressed on relentlessly, forcing the enemy back, until the once confident militia began to break apart. From his position, bleeding but unbowed, Mason watched them fight. Pride filled his eyes. These recruits, who had once mocked him as too old, now fought like seasoned warriors. They were no longer simply following orders. They were carrying his legacy forward. His sacrifice, his pain, his years of experience had forged them into something unstoppable. Minutes later, the gunfire began to fade. The militia was in retreat, their weapons cache destroyed, their spirit broken. The recruits stood victorious, breathing heavily but unshaken. They turned back to look for Mason, and in their faces was not just relief, but deep respect. He had led them into the fire, and through his final command, he had brought them out as soldiers. At last, the battlefield grew quiet. The deafening explosions and endless gunfire faded into silence, replaced only by the distant crackle of fire and the moans of the wounded. A heavy layer of dust hung in the air, drifting slowly to the ground like ash after a storm. The valley, once alive with chaos, now lay in ruins. Yet in that silence, one truth became clear: the militia had been defeated. Their weapons lay scattered, their leaders broken, and their forces driven into retreat. What had begun as a trap meant to crush Mason and his recruits had ended as a stunning victory. Among the rubble and smoke, the young soldiers searched the field with weary eyes. Their bodies ached, their uniforms were torn, and their hands still trembled from the intensity of battle. But victory filled their hearts with strength they had never known before. They looked around, wondering if their commander had survived. For Mason had led them through every step of the fight, and without him, none of this would have been possible. And then, through the settling dust, they saw him. Mason stood tall, battered but alive. His uniform was ripped, his arm bloodied, and his face streaked with dirt and sweat. Yet none of that mattered, because in that moment he seemed larger than life. He was not hunched or broken as they had once imagined him. Instead, he stood taller than any soldier on the field, his presence radiating strength and unshakable resolve. The recruits, who had once mocked him for his age and called him too old to fight, now saw him with new eyes. They no longer saw an aging veteran clinging to the past. They saw a lion, scarred, fierce, and unyielding, who had led them through fire and brought them to victory. His roar had carried them through fear, his wisdom had guided them through chaos, and his courage had given them the strength to push beyond their limits. For the young soldiers, the lesson was eternal. Strength alone had not won the day. It was discipline, strategy, and above all, the unbreakable spirit of a leader who refused to fall. Mason had shown them that a true warrior is not measured by years, but by heart. He had given them more than survival. He had given them purpose, honor, and a glimpse of what it truly meant to be a soldier. As the recruits gathered around him, their eyes were filled not with pity but with reverence. They knew they had fought beside a legend, and that his legacy would live within them forever. Mason, the man they once doubted, had proven that even in the twilight of life, a lion's roar can still shake the earth. Weeks after the battle, the town gathered for a ceremony to honor the victory. The sun hung high, casting golden light across the crowd of young recruits, townspeople, and officials who had come to pay tribute. The once quiet valley, which had witnessed chaos and fire, was now filled with the hum of pride and celebration. For many of the soldiers, it was their first true taste of victory, and they knew it had only been possible because of the man who now stood before them. Colonel Mason walked to the podium slowly, his steps steady despite the wounds that still ached within him. His uniform, though patched and pressed, carried the weight of every scar and every sacrifice. The audience fell silent. Every recruit, every villager, every official turned their eyes toward him, waiting for the words of the man who had turned despair into triumph. When Mason began to speak, his voice was not booming or dramatic. Instead, it was soft but carried a firmness that made every ear listen closely. He did not waste words on glory or praise. He spoke of truth, the kind of truth forged in the fire of battle. Age doesn't kill courage, he said, his tone calm yet unshakable. Experience sharpens it. His words struck the crowd like steel meeting stone. Many of the young recruits, who had once mocked his years, now hung on every syllable. They realized that the wrinkles on his face were not signs of weakness but proof of survival. His age was not a burden, it was a weapon, sharpened by every battle, every hardship, and every lesson learned. Mason paused, scanning the crowd, his gaze settling on the fresh faces of the soldiers who had fought by his side. He continued, "When life tests you, rise. Roar louder than your fear." The words echoed across the ceremony grounds. For the young soldiers, it was more than advice. It was a creed. They remembered the battlefield, the moment when panic had nearly consumed them, and Mason's voice had cut through the smoke, commanding them to advance. That same voice now reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to rise above it. For a brief moment, the silence returned, heavy with respect. Then, like a wave crashing onto the shore, the young soldiers erupted in applause. Their hands came together with thunderous force, their cheers rising into the sky. They were not just honoring a commander, they were honoring a mentor, a lion who had shown them the meaning of strength. In that applause lived a promise. The recruits knew they would carry Mason's lesson into every future battle, every struggle, and every moment of doubt. His words would live on inside them, reminding them to stand tall, to fight with wisdom, and to roar louder than fear itself. Colonel Mason had given them victory, but more importantly, he had given them a legacy.